Aristotle, Plotinus, and St Thomas by A. H. Armstrong. The relationship of the thought of Plotinus to that of St Thomas has, of course, often been discussed in recent years. Dr. Inge's statement that St Thomas's thought is nearer to that of Plotinus than to that of the real Aristotle represents a widely held view, and most of those who have studied the subject agree that the Neo-Platonic element in St Thomas's philosophical inheritance is an important one. But Plotinus's thought is very complex and not always well understood, and it is perhaps still possible to say something about it which will make its relationship to that of St Thomas and the Christian philosophers before him rather clearer. Perhaps, too, some confusion is still sometimes caused in considering the historical background of St Thomas's thought by Thomists, who think of Aristotle as more like St Thomas than he really was. The purpose of this paper is to examine, in a few important questions, how far the difference between the Aristotelianism of Aristotle and the Aristotelianism of St Thomas can be accounted for by the influence of Plotinus. It may be as well to begin with one or two elementary and commonplace cautions. First of all, it is necessary never to forget that St Thomas is a Christian philosopher with a long tradition of Christian thinking behind him, and therefore no synthesis of Hellenic philosophies can ever fully account for his thought. Plotinus only influences St. Thomas through St. Augustine, and less directly through Boethius, Pseudo-Dionysius, the Jewish and Arab traditions, etc. And the Bible and the dogmas of the Church are more important influences on St. Thomas even than St. Augustine. We must avoid, too, that old-fashioned and dangerously erroneous view of the history of traditional European philosophy which sees it as a continual conflict between Platonism and Aristotelianism. The relation between the two is rather one of continual fruitful interaction with a great deal of incidental controversy on matters of very various importance. The Middle Platonists were full of Aristotle, though there was an anti-Aristotelian party among them, and of Plotinus, Porphyry says with much truth that in his writings there is condensed the metaphysics of Aristotle. And not only the metaphysics, but the psychology, with some very original applications. Porphyry himself was a distinguished commentator on Aristotle's logical works. The Platonic tradition, which St. Thomas inherited, was a tradition already containing a very large Aristotelian element. We must not let disputes between Christian Platonists and Aristotelians on a few admittedly important points blind us to the large amount which they have in common. The first question which I propose to discuss is the most important one in metaphysics or natural theology, that of the nature of the first cause, first principle, or God. Let us first consider Aristotle's God, which is a cosmological hypothesis with little ethical or religious significance. For Plato, God or the gods had been first and foremost a moral providence. The central article of Plato's creed is that the universe is governed by a good intelligence, or intelligences, which provides both motive power and direction. This intelligence does not appear to be thought of as omnipotent, still less infinite, and it is conditioned in its working by other universal forces and realities, the irrational material and the forms. Aristotle eliminates providence and that passionate belief in a good, world-ruling intelligence with the union of religion and morality which it involves, which was so strange and new in the Hellenic world, and which Plato had inherited from Socrates. Aristotle is as satisfied as Victorian and many modern scientists with the idea of unconscious teleology, the unwilled, undeliberate, unintelligent working of natural forces to an end. His universe is an almost completely closed, self-contained system of natural causes. Almost, but not quite, for his analysis of motion and change shows him the necessity of an unchanging first cause, an unmoved mover. The sole function of this unmoved mover is, however, to move undeliberately and unconsciously by attraction the primum mobile, or outermost celestial sphere from which motion is transmitted to the rest of the universe. It is worth noticing that Aristotle's proof of the existence of the unmoved mover in Metaphysics 11 depends upon the previous proof of the eternity of at least the first circular motion. The eternity of the universe is, of course, an essential feature of Aristotelian and later Platonic theology. Aristotle is sufficiently Platonic to make his unmoved mover a mind, but it is a very limited mind, thinking only about its own thinking. We can see that pure act involves absolute infinity of being, that if God is pure act, he is simply being, but there is no evidence that Aristotle saw it. He asserts the absolute simplicity of the unmoved mover, and consequently, in a certain sense, its infinity, as being capable of causing circular motion for an infinite time. But he never goes any further. His unmoved mover is the supreme being, but not absolute being. It is the automatic driving force of the eternal machinery of the celestial spheres on which, through the motion of the sun in the ecliptic, all motion and change in the sublunary world depends. The best indication of the essentially cosmic character of Aristotle's God is the revised version of his theology in Chapter 8 of Metaphysics 11, where, in order to adapt his theology to the latest astronomical discoveries, he decides that not one, but 55 unmoved movers are required to explain the motions of the heavens. The Middle Platonists, the immediate precursors of Plotinus, who are greatly influenced by Aristotle and are also developing the thought of Plato's immediate disciple Xenocrates, unite in their description of the first principle, Plato's first principle of the world of forms, the transcendent form of the good, the sun of the intelligible world, which Plato had called one, and Xenocrates also mind, with Aristotle's self-thinking mind. But though the transcendence of this first principle is stressed, and it is said to be the cause not only of the world, but of the forms, which are its thoughts, it is always head of the eternal hierarchy of being and nothing more, within the cosmos, though in a position of unspeakably august supremacy, not outside it. This, of course, is in accordance with all Hellenic tradition. With Plotinus comes a very noticeable change in the understanding of the first principle. Plotinus, being a good Hellenist, continues to maintain the eternity of the hierarchic cosmos, spiritual and material, and its unbroken continuity. He emphasizes them both very strongly by his doctrines of production as the necessary automatic reflex of contemplation and of necessary emanation, the unwilled, undeliberate, inevitable procession of the cosmic hierarchy from its first principle, the One. But his account of the One itself shows a real metaphysical advance, the degree and importance of which has sometimes been obscured by misinterpretation of Plotinus's own thought and that of his immediate predecessors. In the Enneads, we see something which is not to be found in any earlier Hellenic philosophy, the beginnings of a perception of the really transcendent absolute, the God of Christian metaphysics. Plotinus develops Plato's mysterious hints about the form of the good in Republic 6 in a way which leads him far beyond the bounds of Platonic thought as it had so far developed, though without the Middle Platonist metaphysics and Platonic exegesis, especially of the Parmenides, Plotinus's development would not have been possible. Plotinus's one, or good, his usual names for the supreme principle, is something much more than a transcendent mind. It is beyond mind and beyond being, accessible only in the mystical union. It is utterly transcendent and yet accessible in mystical contemplation and without intermediaries to the soul. In this, Plotinus differs very sharply from the later, post-iamblichean Neoplatonism which we know best from Proclus. It is everywhere and nowhere. 6, 8, 16. It is light above light. 5, 3, 12. The grace which is shed from it upon the forms gives their beauty an attractiveness which it would not otherwise possess. 6, 7, 22. Plotinus has two lines of approach to this transcendent supreme, one positive, the other negative. There seems at times to be a certain tension or disharmony, though not contradiction, between them. When he speaks positively of the one, it is certainly as real, even if it is beyond being. It wills and loves itself, 6, 8, 16, and is its own act, the cause of its existence by its own self-directed love. It does not think, but it has a sort of superthought. But he sometimes also speaks of it in terms of extreme negativity, as nothing, formless, neither this nor that, 6, 9, 3, and 5. He insists that no predicates can be applied to it for fear of destroying its unity. We are familiar with this sort of language in later Christian discussions about the divine simplicity. But are we justified in holding that Plotinus is using it in anything like this later Christian sense, and not, as some passages in the Enneads would suggest, in a Neo-Pythagorean way, making the one the bare unity which is the source of all number, or even in the manner of Speusippus, making the one the ultimate formlessness from which all forms evolve? 4:8-6. The ideas of the Neo-Pythagoreans, of Speusippus, and even of the Stoics do undoubtedly appear in a number of places in the Enneads. But there are also passages which show that Plotinus did arrive at something very like the Christian conception of divine simplicity and unbounded plenitude. He brings the two together at the end of 6:7-37. This is apparent above all in chapters 37-39 of the 7th treatise of the 6th Ennead. Plotinus is explaining his most important and, to Christian ears, most startling negations, that the one does not think and does not even exist. He makes it quite clear that he means that it does not think only in the sense that there is in it no actualization of potency, no real distinction of thought and object of thought, that its regard of itself is nothing else but itself. And in this treatise at least, and in the closely related 6:8, written about the same time, Plotinus's thought does vary and develop, though within fairly narrow limits. He seems to mean by is not precisely what Augustine, Bonaventure, and Thomas mean by saying that God is not a substance in the sense of a subject to which predicates can be applied, or that he is outside all categories, including that of substance. Plotinus's view of God's transcendence of the Aristotelian categories, in fact, is precisely that of the Christian tradition, which on this point derives from him and his disciple Porphyry through St. Augustine. Of course, the whole doctrine, not only of God's relation to the universe, but of his own nature, was put in a new light by the Jewish Christian doctrine of free creation, instead of the necessary emanation or procession of the eternal universe. This is the decisive difference between the Christian and Platonic conceptions of God. But it remains true that St. Thomas's doctrine of the nature of God, insofar as it owes anything to Hellenic philosophy, is closer to and derives more from Plotinus than Aristotle. What St. Thomas is doing in his natural theology is to use Aristotelian principles to produce a demonstration of the existence of a God whose nature Aristotle never fully grasped, a demonstration which itself has a breadth and independence of any particular astronomical scheme which Aristotle never attained. The history of the relationship of the doctrine of the ideas in the divine mind to that of the divine simplicity shows a very interesting metaphysical development. The doctrine, as is well known, originated among the Middle Platonists and presented no difficulty to them, as they had no clear conception of the absolute simplicity of the divine being. Plotinus, who had such a conception, found it necessary to make his supreme one transcend the divine mind containing the ideas, which he calls the one being, the second and inferior stage of divinity. Plotinus' solution was not a possible one for Christian theologians, because there is no room in Christian theology for degrees of divinity, and it was of great importance that a satisfactory solution should be worked out because of the close connection of the doctrine of ideas with the eternal generation of the Word and with creation. St. Augustine does little more than state the problem. The classical reconciliation of the doctrine of ideas with that of the absolute simplicity of the divine thought was worked out in the Middle Ages and is to be found expressed with admirable clearness and subtlety in St. Thomas's Summa and St. Bonaventure's commentary on the sentences. Another very important question on which St. Thomas's answer, which is derived from St. Augustine, owes something to Plotinus is that of the origin of evil. Plato had explained evil by the existence in the visible universe of a disorderly, irrational cosmic principle. Aristotle is still influenced by this idea in his account of physical evil. Very illogically, on his own principles, he speaks of matter thwarting and frustrating the realization of form. It is in this way that he explains monstrous births. For moral evil, however, he recognizes no efficient cause outside human choice. The Middle Platonists and Neo-Pythagoreans have various interpretations of Plato's doctrine. Plutarch believes in an evil cosmic soul, and Eumenius, perhaps under the Eastern influence, which also shows itself in Gnosticism, that matter is the principle of evil. In Plotinus, some of the elements of the true solution are to be found. The essential parts of the Augustinian Thomist answer to the question of evil are: 1. The idea of evil as a negation, nothing positive, though at the same time certainly real, a real privation. 2. That physical evils, privation, corruption, destruction of the parts contribute directly to the order, harmony, and beauty of the whole cosmos, and that even moral evil is overruled and brought round to contribute in some way to the good of the whole. Plotinus asserts, too, with unsurpassed force, though a certain harshness notably in the two treatises on Providence, 3.2 and 3, written at the end of his life, in which the loci communes of Stoic and Cynic preaching are united with Platonic and Aristotelian ideas of free will and moral responsibility to form a very impressive picture of the cosmos, ruled by the Logos and man's place and duty therein. The, to our minds, repellent harshness of some passages comes from Plotinus's deliberate rejection, 3:2-9, of any idea of the possibility of redemption and the forgiveness of sins. But on the fundamental doctrine of evil as privation, Plotinus occupies a curious middle position. He holds that evil is negative, but also that matter is the cause of evil, being absolute negativity and the principle of negation. Plotinus disagrees with Aristotle's distinction between matter and privation. For him, matter is privation, the infinite, formless, absolute negation of form. It does not really unite with form and is not actualized by it, but remains a radical evil and deficiency and cause of deficiency. That is, evil in things, especially 2:4, on the two kinds of matter, and 1:8, the origin of evils. It must be remembered that Plotinus makes a very clear distinction between matter and body. Matter is evil, but the material world, the world of bodies, is good, for body is formed of matter, even though form and matter never truly unite, and form is altogether good. Proclus goes a stage further and arrives at the true doctrine. For him, matter is caused by the one and is not an independent principle, as it was for Plotinus and all previous Platonists, and therefore it is part of the universal order, and not the principle of evil, which is for Proclus, as it is for the Christian philosophers, a real privation without any efficient cause. Finally, we may glance at a trace of Neo-Platonism in St. Thomas's doctrine of the nature of man, the point in his system where he is rightly considered most Aristotelian and in the sharpest opposition to the Platonic Augustinian tradition. But man, according to St. Thomas, is very different from man according to Aristotle. For Aristotle, soul is the inseparable form of the body, and in the same way as with any other form-matter composite, there can be no question of any disembodied, separate existence of the form. There is only the impersonal, because without memory, immortality of the actualizing principle of knowledge, the separable reason, whose transcendence of the concretum Aristotle finds it necessary to hold rather as he does that of the unmoved mover in relation to the cosmos. Alexander of Aphrodisias and other later Aristotelians identified the two, almost certainly wrongly. It is worth noting that soul of every grade except rational, which involves the presence of separable reason, can be spontaneously generated from liquid containing the material vital principle, which Aristotle calls symphyton pneuma. For St. Thomas, who is after all a Christian, the human soul is and must be a complete spiritual substance capable of independent existence, yet it is also the form of the body. He reconciles these two statements by the doctrine, which is characteristically Plotinian and plays a very important part in the structure of Plotinus' system, that a higher reality can act as form to a lower reality while having a complete, fully substantial existence on its own plane. In Plotinus, this doctrine is bound up with the idea of universal contemplation, and is really a cosmic application of Aristotle's account of knowledge. Used in this way, it is of great value for explaining the relationship between spiritual beings. But St. Thomas sees that it is capable of a wider application, and uses it to unite body and soul far more closely than the Platonists ever did, while preserving soul's essential independence and substantiality. He is able to do this because he is free from the false and confusing notions about matter in the visible world as evil and incapable of being actualized by form, which hamper Plotinus' thought at this point. We may sum up then by saying that in all that very important part of St. Thomas's thought, which is common to him and to the older Augustinian tradition, the influence of Plotinus is considerable. It was Plotinus who, more than anyone else, brought Hellenic philosophy to a point where it could meet Christian doctrine to produce the new synthesis of the Philosophia Perennis. St. Thomas's Aristotelianism is the application of the great Aristotelian principles which his genius was able to liberate and purify from the unacceptable elements in Aristotle's system to the completion or correction of the Christian Plotinian tradition, with its large Aristotelian element, which he received from his predecessors, above all from St. Augustine. Opinions may differ about the value of some of his innovations, but it is important to understand that they are variations within a great common tradition, which derives on the one side from the Bible and the teaching of the Church, and on the other from Plotinus.